Welcome everyone to the lecture 29 of the course Climate Change and Extreme Events. So this is week 10. So in the previous lecture we have talked about multiple policies, whether it is global policies to mitigate the climate extremes or negative effects of climate change. We have discussed about UNFCCC model, then we have discussed about Kyoto protocols, then we have discussed about Paris Agreement. All of these are basically policies we have discussed in the last class, that these are the framework they have set up. But when we are talking about managing the climate extremes or negative impact of climate change across different parts of the world, that is very variable in nature. Some places you have observed a very high intensity floods are coming, which means those are very highly exposed to the flooding events or high magnitude flow hydrological extreme events like that. There are some regions which are highly exposed to the drought events. Some regions may be floods and droughts both are occurring together. So therefore, because of these variability in the climate change or climate extremes nature, the targeted approach should be adopted across all of these different regions, whether it is tropical or higher latitude or mid latitude regions like that. To facilitate these frameworks, for example, UNFCCC's Kyoto Protocol, Paris Agreements, there are various national frameworks has been also set up, and the goal of these national framework is to facilitate whatever the framework has been set up internationally, that has to be narrowed down to that particular region depending upon what kind of the climate extremes these regions are facing. So therefore, for the specific region we have to have some sort of targeted climate extremes models or these frameworks, so that these areas should be minimize the impact of those climate change in the recent or warming levels, for example. In this particular lecture 29, we will talk about more on the risk reduction strategies and community resilience. Why it is important? So let's suppose there are pre-disaster or let's say there is a climate extremes events happen in particular region. We can divide that time period into two parts, before the event and after the event. Before the event, what is important in terms of disaster risk reduction or DRR or risk reduction strategies? Prevention and preparedness, because before the event, if we are prepared or we have a certain technologies that can prevent the negative consequences of the climate extremes, we can save a lot of socioeconomic impacts and lots of physiological or sociological or different types of impacts like that. So that is basically pre-disaster activities, risk assessment and planning, and reconstruction of, let's say, infrastructures which are very old or needs some sort of urgent maintenance or something like that. There is another time period which is a post disaster or after the event, where we are talking mostly on the recovery and response. So the response is immediate. Basically we are talking about emergency management. How do we handle that situation if any kind of extreme events will occur in a certain region, and what could be our recovery plan? Let's say if the infrastructure has been damaged, or let's say people have been migrated, or let's say there is a serious effect on socioeconomic conditions, what could be our steps to basically recover that damage which has been done by a particular extreme events. So in this lecture we will primarily talk about the risk reduction framework for climate and disaster resilience. We will explore community based adaptation strategy. We will examine some case studies of successful resilient programs, and then we will also identify the challenge and policy recommendation for risk reductions. So what is exactly risk reduction and resilience? When you are talking about a particular climate extremes, we are basically trying to mitigate the negative consequences of those extremes like that. How do we do that? Decrease the disaster impact, minimize the disaster effects through some sort of proactive measures. It could be emergency response, it could be preventive measurements or measures which we can take before the event like that. There is a mitigation action. What could be the strategies to mitigate that effect in the future? Then we have talking about risk assessment. We have to have a prior understanding of if a certain level of climate extremes will occur in certain region, what would be the hazards and what would be the vulnerabilities of that region. Overall risk assessment of different, it depends upon. So, if you go back to the previous lectures, we have talked about how do we quantify the risk based on multiple parameters we can take into account, whether it could be the population based or the income based or the level of hazards they are likely to be faced in the future or current scenarios like that. Then the disaster preparedness, what is the planning of disaster in terms of early warning system or some sort of technical expertise we have, so that we can at least prepare for that disaster beforehand. So, these are some sort of risk reduction framework. How do we increase? So, there is a community resilience is also playing a very important role when you are talking about risk reduction. What is their community resilience towards certain types of climate extremes? So, in the resilience, basically we talk about anticipate the risk, prepare for the disasters, what is the response to the events during that particular event, and what would be the recovery from the disasters from the different communities like that. So, that is how basically we can define the community resilience. So, there is a one particular figure where it shows that how do we define the risk, resilience and fragility. So, there are different index, different terminologies are written here, which basically discriminate between these different terms in terms of how do we differentiate between these different terminologies like that. So, what is the components of risk reduction strategies? We primarily talk about the early warning system, basically set up those technical things which can predict the behavior before disaster, and then we can, based on that, we can plan to mitigate that effect more effectively. So, how do we do that? We can monitor that observations based on historical data records and all. Then we can apply some sort of data analysis tools, forecasting models, predictive models like that, that can tell us about what is the historical pattern and what is likely to happen. Let us say you can also apply probability density functions. So, that can also calculate what is the probability of occurrences of different extreme events like that. Then we can also think about alert systems. It could be mobile based, it could be email based, or it could be some sort of those systems which can gives us information in more real time scenario. So, let us say there is a flood is coming, and how we can propagate that message to the community in a very short span of time, so that people can be prepared for that particular events like that. And what is the actionable alert, so that we can provide some sort of clear objectives, clear guidelines to response based on disaster severity and type. So, this has to be done beforehand, so that we can have a better understanding of what would be the impact of different events like that. Then the community and education and capacity building, that is also very important because if you do not aware, if you do not want to aware the communities or people or those living very close to the area which are frequently suffering from climate extremes, we will not be able to implement many other technologies as well. If you talk about, let us say, alert system, actionable alerts like that. So, community training program is very important, where we train people related to different types of climate extremes, okay, do's and don'ts. Public awareness campaign that has to be done within the curriculum of the education system as well, and also a part of public awareness campaign. So, where we can aware people at least about what is likely to be happen and what we should do during a particular climate extreme events like that. Building a local capacity, which means strengthening the local skills and resources in a certain region, or collaboration with the schools and colleges and scholars, so that we can integrate our knowledge into the resilience and social curricula or some sort of disaster mitigation plans like that. Then there is another strategies called infrastructure resilience strategies, because lots of time we have seen that whenever the climate extremes or extreme climatic behavior occurs, it directly affects the infrastructures, which generally impact the socio-economic conditions of one particular place. Therefore, we have to be very sure about what is the likelihood of impact on different infrastructures, what is the community functionality, what is the climate proof housing, if there is a flood barriers are there, what is the resilience of roads towards different types of climate extremes, what is their green infrastructures in terms of long term mitigation plans like that. So, these are the some of the plans which we also take into account when we are talking about some sort of disaster risk reduction strategies. So, overall when you are talking about the role of how do we implement those strategies, policy and governance are the one which are plays a very significant role. For example, there is a national DRR policies, disaster risk reduction policies. There are legislative approaches which can implement that policies into strategies into certain region. Then we can talk about institutional frameworks which basically defines the role for disaster management. Then we can talk about disaster management plan which coordinated effect on recovery and some sort of early warning system or some sort of data analytics or alert system design like that. Then there is a international collaborations, for example, transboundary region, or let us say we can learn something from some other region which they have successfully mitigated the impact of climate extremes. One example is let us say Netherlands. Netherlands is the country which are highly susceptible to flood, coastal flooding, and therefore how they have managed it, or let us say if you talk about Australian the heat wave plans, how do they are counterbalancing the effect of heat wave in those regions like that. So, these are the international collaborations, and we can learn from their overall procedures. We can implement based on our requirement targeted approaches for a certain region, and then we can think about how we can further enhance these DRR efforts in terms of international collaborations like that. What is the total disaster risk management cycle? If you talk about, let us say there is a normal or disaster risk reduction stage where we talk about generally the early warning system, search and rescue or management of risk establishment like that. There is an emergency situation when that particular events occurs, then we talk about multiple for example, we are talking about the multiple losses that incurred during that particular time, and the another period is called recovery stage where we are talking about the restoration and we talk about the mitigation, or let us say we are talking about how do we restore the whole system after that particular exposure. So, this is the overall timeline of a particular extremes which occurs and how we can implement different types of strategies to further reduce the impact of disaster risk in certain regions. What is the community's role on reduction strategy? Is very important role because it gives you the ecosystem based adaptation, which means it will provides ecosystem service, enhance the community resilience, reduce the vulnerabilities and restore the ecosystem of a certain region which are disaster prone, which is a kind of ecosystem based applications or applying the traditional and indigenous knowledge. For example, talking about weather forecasting, using the natural sign to predict weather, traditional agricultural practices which is not relying upon only the chemical based fertilizer, or maybe you can use some sort of different types of farmings which basically more oriented towards organic cropping. Cultural practices for resilience, that is social norms for promoting the preparedness, how we can prepare for certain different types of extreme events. And then we also talk about the indigenous land management, managing land to maintain ecosystem health. So, for example, if a heat wave occurs or drought occurs, we can be better prepared for that particular events like that. Then there is another important strategies which is called social networks and mutual aid. How we can strengthen the community ties with together so that we can have a community based risk management that can basically circulate across that community level, and we can work together, not individual but as a whole team, so that we can reduce further the risk in that particular region. Mutual aid groups, social capacity development, some sort of technical programs or development programs like that, and information sharing, which is very important. Let us say somebody has got the information about the flood water, it should pass to some other people, neighboring people, so that they can be also be prepared during some sort of catastrophe. So, in this kind of situation model, we would be able to reduce the vulnerabilities more effectively by integrating all these different knowledges, ecosystem based knowledge, traditional indigenous knowledge, social networks and mutual aids like that. So, this is one of the case study flood resilience in the Bangladesh. For example, Bangladesh is a country which is highly flood affected because of the Ganga river, of course, and there is a Brahmaputra, and there is a Ganga and Brahmaputra delta which also formed the downstream part. So, that is one thing, because river is carrying a huge amount of water to that particular country, as well as we are seeing the sea level is rising, and therefore, it is also affecting the floods of the Bangladesh region or coastal regions like that. And Bangladesh is also sort of developing economies, therefore, it is also very important to look into those regions which are using very important points to basically mitigate that extreme events. So, they are basically looking at the frequent monsoon flood impacts on Bangladesh based on historical records, monsoon floods, how the monsoon floods has been behaved historically, what is the overall displacement of community forced to evacuate from one place to the another place, loss of livelihood and vulnerability of community. So, these are the data records they have already have, they have run through that particular data analytics, and they understand all these different statistics of. Based on these knowledge, historical knowledge, they have some measures, some sort of adaptation measures, which is basically infrastructure modifications, raising the house structures, or some sort of floating agriculture, or changes in the agricultural practices so that they can minimize the impact of socio-economic during some sort of climate extremes. So, when you are talking about infrastructure, basically they are looking at the protection from the floods. It could be some sort of wall which can protect the flood waves, or it could be some sort of some sort of water resource structures. Social stability, where they can provide a social stability to the neighboring communities like that, and floating agriculturals, basically some sort of changes in the agricultural practices that can provide or stable the food sources during and after, let us say, climate extreme events. So, this is basically how they have done. So, enhance the resilience, basically the sustainable sustained livelihood and reduce the displacement. These are three key pillars where they have relied upon, and therefore, they have minimized the overall impact of climate extremes, particularly floods in the Bangladesh region. So, they have done some sort of traditional flood impact knowledge, and then based on that adaptation measures, and then that is basically they have applied across those regions which are highly flood vulnerable in Bangladesh, and reduce the impact of flood impacts in this particular region. There is another case study of wildfire preparedness in Australia. We have also seen there are lots of wildfire across the world. Australia has done something to protect their wild resources or ecosystems because of these wildfires, heat waves events. So, basically they have done some sort of climate change fuel wildfire in some sort of historical analysis. They looked at the property damage, what is the wildfire life loss, what is the ecosystem disruptions, what is the human risk based on some sort of wildfires intensity and fire frequency and severity based on the historical time record. Then they have, based on this, basically they have implemented some sort of fire management system. Based on that, they have done some sort of community preparedness and fire management, reduce facilities like that. That is reduce the fatalities of fire in certain region, reduce the property damage. Based on that, basically they have implemented certain, so that basically minimize the damage to the homes and infrastructures, and they have basically improved the ecosystem resilience based on control burns and fires in that region. What their strategy was, they have established the fire breaks, a kind of a that can basically break the fire in certain region. Then they have basically implement the control burns in certain region, and they have done some sort of conduct community drills, so that people can aware about how do we mitigate the effect of these kind of wildfire in that certain regions. What are the challenges of these? So there is a escalation of cost to implement these strategies. Still there are some loss of lives because of the destruction of the properties, and there is a ecosystem damages because of these wildfires and habitat suffers. So that basically gives an hope that okay, this is the wildfire mitigation strategies. Now they have to implement or improve something so that they can overcome the challenges what they have seen so far based on that implementations and all. So these are the case studies which clearly shows that based on the data analytics, historical data record, not only the climate extremes but social and the geographical areas data set and all, we would be able to understand more clearly about the pattern of the climate extremes, and based on that we will start thinking about applying some sort of adaptation strategies. Once we adopt those strategies, we think about how we can basically improve the strategies further so that we can further overcome the limitations of those strategies like that. Now further, what is the role of technology in risk reduction? It is very important. As the time is going, we see that there is many advancement in the satellite or remote sensing or data analysis, or let us say AI and ML and all. That basically gives an hope that if you integrate these technological advancement in the risk reduction, we would be able to get upper edge, or basically to protect the vulnerable communities from these fire incidents, or let us say another types of climate extremes. So this satellite and remote sensing, the advancement basically gives a hope that we would be able to better manage the hazard mapping. We would be able to provide more detailed information of vegetation and soil monitoring. We would be able to move forward towards the better forecasting of weather. So that is basically, when we integrate all these together, we would be able to have a better understanding of real-time climate hazard monitoring because of the advancement of satellite based remote sensing and other digital image processing in geoinformatics methods like that. Then there is a artificial intelligence and big data analysis, which is growing day by day, and that is now become multiple sectors are leveraging these technologies to basically to manage or improve their efficiencies. So disaster risk reduction can also take these technologies into their frameworks, and can be utilized to further understand the disaster preparedness or predictions, for example, risk assessment more clearly, or let us say we can think about optimizing the resource allocated. We have certain amount of resources available during the any disaster time or after disaster, how we can optimize these resource allocation across different communities so that we have a balance across all this. Then there is a real time decision making. So AI will also gives an hope that we can make a real time crisis decision, so that what should be the primary emphasis on a certain climate extremes during time like that. Then there is a mobile based early warning system, that is also a part of technological revolutions, that gives you more updated or more advanced early alerts. Disaster communication will basically facilitate it, and basically it's a critical information when we are talking about any disaster preparedness. Crowdsourced data set, we can get a data from multiple people across different parts of the region, so that we can have a crowdsourced data, and that can tell us about what is the location of that climate extremes in that particular region. So that is also very helpful. And there is a preparedness and educations, basically it can give you multiple information about how do we prepare or how we educate ourselves towards a certain types of climate extremes like that. What is the policy and governance of the risk reduction? Basically policies and governance of risk reduction, basically they set up the framework, and that has to be applied across that particular region, and that is basically make sure that the region should be completely free from some sort of climate extremes based on some policy and governance implementations like that. So that is the understanding of the disaster risk, that is number one. then they are strengthening the governance, investing in the resilience and preparedness in the response, and building back better or basically infrastructures. How do we do that? There are several SDGs, there are several risk reduction policies or plans has been proposed by a global level. For example, no poverty, sustainable cities, vulnerable communities, resilient infrastructure, climate response policies and all. If you integrate all these, we basically achieve SDGs through disaster risk reduction framework. When we are talking about this disaster risk reduction framework into policy, we have primarily looked into the improved governance, we primarily looked into the sustainable development of that particular region, or coherent approach aligned with the long term strategies with the immediate needs. For example, empowering the communities, for example local communities, addressing the specific risk about climate extremes like that. Then there is a DRR and SDG integrations. So, we have SDG connections, then basically we can think about framing some sort of disaster risk reduction framework, that is a national action plan. National action plan we basically make for multiple different purposes, and then there is a local actions. So, that basically targeted policies or actionable things for a local particular region, and then we can apply in certain region to implement that risk reduction strategies in certain regions like that. So, policies, governance, different types of infrastructures, renovations and all, they all need some sort of financial resources to implement properly in certain region. So, what source of the financing of risk reduction and resilience? That is a national regional project, that could be climate adaptation focus, grants and loans from different companies or different bodies, global and national bodies like that. Long term resilient project, disaster risk management and emergency response funds. These are some of the important things which we should have. It's part of the source of climate finance. Then there is a microfinance for community adaptation. Provide affordable financial products, small loans, saving to vulnerable populations like that. Invest in the resilience measure, funding projects like disaster resistance or early warning systems like that, or maybe collaborate with the local organization for local groups to address specific climate vulnerabilities, or let us say we can enhance the community resilience, strengthening the community's capacity to withstand climate impacts. So, how do we implement all of these? Basically public private partnership. We can have a private sector, we can have a public sector, a sector which can basically integrate together, that can be form some sort of public private partnership like that. That has to have some sort of innovative funding models, expertise sharing and example use case, so that we can think about implementing all these resources in different parts of the regions like that, and empowering the resilience through different strategic financing and innovations. For example, resource mobilization, we can think about scalable solutions, we can think about sustainable development, and we can think about some sort of private sector innovations like that. So, what are the barriers in these effective risk reduction strategies? Are some sort of economic and resource constraints, limiting financial resources, for example, or challenges in the prioritization or impact on the infrastructures, or there is a community preparedness and education gaps can also sometimes plays a very important role in barriers on effective risk reduction. Informed but unprepared, engaged community, over prepared for but misguided, or unaware and unprepared like that. So, these are some of the challenges which we have, which can become a barrier to the effective risk reduction, and then we have to think about how we can overcome these different issues like that. What could be the future direction for enhancing the resilience? Enhancing AI driven risk mapping, for example, technological advancement, real time forecasting, or let us say some sort of drone and satellite imagery integration of those, or IoT sensors that can provide enhancing the technologies innovation, and that can basically provide more information about a certain climatic extremes in a region. Scaling up the national based solutions, that is another approach. Green infrastructure, coastal protection, urban greening, or cost effectiveness or biodiversity. These are the primary objectives of nature-based solutions, or strengthening the global cooperations, financial support, regional collaborations, or knowledge sharing. These are the some sort of strengthening the global cooperations that basically can achieve the global resilience towards different types of climate extremes like that. So, in this particular lecture, we have primarily talked about different types of risk reduction strategies and resilience requires for different types of integrated strategies. We have talked about community based adaptation enhance local capacities like that, and we have also talked about how we can integrate technology, policies, or financial that play a very critical role or improving the resilience of different communities based on these extreme events like that. So, in this lecture we have talked about primarily the disaster risk reduction DRR. In the next lecture we will discuss about what is the adaptation policies for climate extremes, and we will take also some sort of case studies to demonstrate how we can adopt these policies to reduce the climate extremes in different parts of the world. Thank you so much for listening this lecture.